So many of you don't know that I live in the United States, and I live in Northern California, and I don't live too far away from a big Guardwara, which is it is a temple within Sikhism. And annually, every year in Yuba City, California, thousands of Sikhs, or those that practice Sikhism, they migrate to Yuba City, California for a parade. And so I've encountered Sikhism for a long time. Oftentimes Sikhism is conflated with Hinduism. Right? In Hinduism, there's a lot of different branches, but Sikhism and Jainism and Hinduism, so they're all Eastern religions, but Sikhism it's a fairly recent religion, and any individual that practices Sikhi they're passionate about, and they treat it as a virtue that their faith is new. It's rather recent or early in terms of its history. And it goes back to Guru, so Guru, teacher for them, Nanak. And I don't want to go too deep into the historical background of the Sikh faith, but instead I want to discuss the Sikh understanding, the Sikhi understanding of God. Because from a philosophical standpoint, Sikhism is interesting because it's difficult to evaluate and determine whether or not it is pantheistic like Hinduism or panentheistic like process theology. And my own assessment is that Sikhi, their conception of God is panentheistic. And so panentheism is different than pantheism. So let's first start with pantheism, which is characteristic of Hinduism. So in Hinduism, God is numerically identical to creation, and creation is numerically identical to God. It is monism, the idea that there's only one substance, namely God, and God has different modes in which he expresses himself in what we perceive, right? And they have a distinction between Maya, right? So everything that we see as distinct is in fact united, and that there is no actual real distinctions between anything. All is God, all is one, and one is all is God, and God is all in pantheism. And there are distinctions that Hindus make, but to see a more physical monism, you could look at Spinoza. So Hinduism is a spiritual monism. Everything is taken as immaterial, all is Brahman, and then Brahman is expressed in the 360 million gods of Hinduism, right? So you have Keshav, Vishnu. So the main ones, Hindus will define God. They'll use the term God as a acronym. G is for the generator, Brahma, I think, or it's Vishnu. O stands for operator, and D stands for destroyer, which I believe is Shiva. Right? So I think it's Vishnu. Shiva, and then Brahma. Right? That's Hinduism in their understanding. Then there's all these other gods. You think of Krishna, Gesha, right? And this is in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, right? So that's Hinduism. And then you have Islam, right? Because Hinduism is very old, right? Islam, 6th century, I think, 6th century AD for Islam. So Muhammad, who is understood as a prophet in Islam, he starts receiving what he takes to be revelation from God, and he recites it, and it is recorded. And he has a Unitarian monotheism, and he has the five pillars? The five pillars. So the Shahada, the creed, speaking the creed. You have good works. Pray 5 times a day. You go on the Hajj, right? And you have jihad, which that's going to be understood differently between the different Muslims. Some are going to see that as a struggle in daily life. Others are going to see that as an actual war, right? And the idea is that Guru Nanak took these ideas and he discovered something that transcends both of these faiths, right? And one of the things that he took, he says, that these names that you use, Rama, Allah, he's basically saying that all these names are referring to the same God, and that once you realize that and you love God, you will be enlightened. You will come to know the truth, right? So that's kind of some of the ideas that I take for Sikhism. But Sikhism is interesting because, like I said, it's difficult to demarcate its conception of God. I take it that it is panentheistic. So I've discussed how Hinduism is pantheism. It's spiritual monism. Whereas Islam is clearly dualistic. It takes God to be a distinct substance from creation, right? So it's not monistic. Now there may be idealistic Muslims that affirm some type of monism, but generally Islam is going to be similar to and I mean Judaism, like some of the traditions in Judaism are idealists, so they do affirm some form of spiritual monism, right? Hasidic, there you go. Hasidic Jews, certain Hasidic Jew sects actually are monists. They are idealists, and so they are spiritual monists as well. And we see some of that even in Christian tradition, but they're not pantheistic. They're panentheistic. And so we need to make a distinction from pantheism, where everything is numerically identical, right? With panentheistic, where everything is not numerically identical. So God is not numerically identical to his creation. Rather, they are numerically distinct, but mutually dependent, right? And this is understood typically, the metaphor is the soul and the body. God is the soul of the universe, and the universe is God's body. And that's the conception of God for panentheists. And so the way I see Sikhism, they affirm this conception of God, that in some sense the world or the universe is part of God. And they'll say that within every human heart is a spark of divinity, that God is pervasive in everything. And that's the apt analogy that panentheists use, is they'll say that much like the soul indwells the whole body, but they're numerically distinct. That's the type of language that I hear those that affirm Sikhism, that's basically what they say. And the way I would summarize, the way I understand Sikhism, so they affirm panentheism. That's the way I understand their understanding of God. They're religious pluralists. So similar to Hinduism, in Hinduism, you have this idea of bhakti, where you can devote yourself to one particular deity and you will still receive. For Hindus, it's moksha, being in union with God, right? When you get out of the cycle of reincarnation for the Hindu faith, you enter into a state of moksha, which is heaven for them, right? Which is becoming one with God. Well, in Sikhism, they have a very similar idea that they're seeking to achieve the union with God, where their individual identity is completely submerged into God. They become one with God. And again, this goes back to this panentheistic understanding that everything that exists is either numerically identical to God or part of God in some way, shape, or form, right? And that's the conception I see for the Sikh understanding of God. They use this term Waheguru, right? And so it's like this idea of wow, God is amazing, light and dark. You can look up the term Waheguru, what it means, but they use this term for God, or they use the term Sat Nam. And it's interesting, when you encounter Sikhs, there are different sects of Sikhs. Some think of God as impersonal, and they take God as an abstract principle that grounds everything. While others, and that would be kind of similar to Stoicism, right? Where others would affirm God as personal, like the Abrahamic faiths, which we would think of in terms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But that is not the case. It's not clear. There's not a clear consensus. It seems like the intellectuals of Sikhism affirm that God is impersonal, whereas the ordinary believer that you encounter of Sikhism, they think of God as personal. So they're panentheists, they're religious pluralists, so they see all religions that are monotheistic lead to God. And the emphasis for Sikhs, for those that affirm Sikhism, is pragmatism. They're very focused on practice and not ritual, and do what works. That's their mentality. It's a very practical understanding of their faith. They seek peace, right? And this is why they go against Islam and their conception of heaven and hell. They go against the caste system for Hinduism. And it's interesting because they do have, they go against egotism, pride, greed, sexual immorality. They are a firm believer in working hard and the brotherhood of all humanity. They see everyone as a child of God, right? But if we understand that in terms of panentheism, everything is part of God, or it is numerically identical to who and what God is, right? And so I want to do just a quick analysis of this. Okay, so if my understanding of Sikhism is right, then Sikhs, they are panentheists, and therefore either everything is numerically identical to God or numerically distinct, but part of God, right? Because they're mutually dependent. So if that's the case, then evil in all its shapes and forms is either numerically identical to God or part of God. That's a problem, right? Because that would mean that all of these ethical virtues that Sikhs seek to, the ethical virtues for Sikhism, God has determined those things in some part, right? In some way. And so it creates a lot of problems, that God is dependent upon the world and the world depends upon God, and that everything that we see in the world is God or is a part of God. And so all the evil, pain, and suffering, it means that God is undergoing pain, or God is involved in evil, right? And so the Sikh, in order to be able to overcome this, needs to affirm a similar view to those of the Abrahamic faith. They can't say that God is dependent upon the universe, or that God is in some sense part of the universe. You can't say that God is the soul and the universe is his body. If you say that, then you end up in a situation where something about God is evil, right? So it impugns God's character. Now, if you say that they're not, so if you make a distinction and you become a dualist, like the Abrahamic faiths, like myself as a Christian, then you can overcome this challenge, right? But then you can't say that God, you won't be able to say the things that the Sikh faith says, which is that within God, or pardon me, within every human being is a spark of divinity. You can't say that, right? And so you end up undermining some of the core teachings of Sikhism, right? Some of the unique claims of Sikhism, right? Now you could say, a Sikh could say, well, okay, this panentheism is voluntary on God's part, and it's a relationship that God enters into. It's not eternal, but instead it's contingent upon God. And that's interesting, but Sikhism, it resists duality, I should say it this way, Sikhism, it seeks to distance itself from logic. So Sikhism is very similar to some of the apophatic traditions. And so they try to suspend logic and allowing it to be applied to God. And so then God becomes utterly mysterious, and we have no idea what we're talking about. God becomes inscrutable, ineffable, and in my view, unknowable, right? That's what happens with apophatic theology when you begin to merely negate what God is, and you never specify. You don't use cataphatic theology where you actually make clear definitions and distinctions that do apply positively about God. Then you're left with God being inscrutable, ineffable, and incomprehensible, and thus unknowable. And that's why some that follow the teachings of Sikhism, they end up in a view where God is impersonal, right? God becomes an abstract principle, not a person, right? And so just thinking about this further, so with Sikhism, if they affirm pantheism, which that would be even more problematic than panentheism, then they're going to be in the same problems with Hinduism, because Hinduism basically says all is one and one is all. And so then, basically we're all in heaven because there's no distinctions, right? Or for the Hindu, it's moksha. So we're all in union with God because all is God and God is all, right? For the Hindu. But for the Sikh, God is numerically distinct from the universe, but the universe is mutually dependent upon God, and God is dependent upon the universe. And so that also undermines God's perfection. God is not that being which no greater can be thought. For the Abrahamic faiths, God is the greatest conceivable being. And so God transcends the universe and creation. He is not dependent upon it, and he's not part of it. But for Sikhism, if it is panentheistic, that God, in fact, is immanent in everything, such that God is mutually dependent upon everything, and everything is dependent upon God, if there's a mutual dependence relation between God and the universe or his creation, and that God is, in fact, in everything in some way, without being numerically identical to it, then they have a serious problem, right? So for a Sikh, and then so applying this to metaphysics, so it creates a problem in their understanding of being. But then in terms of beliefs, a Sikh cannot have, they can't have rationality, because they don't know if what they're being taught, true or false beliefs, because true and false beliefs would come from God, And given panentheism, it would seem to undermine any rationality or any belief that you have. You kind of have a similar situation where you might have a belief, but you would have no justification to affirm it as rational, right? So you can use Plantinga's work to show that panentheism in its various forms would undermine, it would be a defeater for Sikhism, right? Because Sikhism saying that both good and evil is either numerically identical to God or part of God. And so if it's part of God, if evil, anything evil is part of God, anything that's, because they're saying God is truth, right? Sat Nam means truth. So if God is truth, and then the universe is part of truth, which also includes falsehood, then any belief that you have, if it's true or false, you would have no justification to affirm that your belief is rational, that you would affirm it. Everything that you take to be true can be undermined by panentheism. And so this is kind of like an evolutionary argument, that Plantinga gives against the rationality of evolution. You can kind of use something similar to that applied to panentheism. And then in terms of ethics, I've already kind of addressed that. You have the same issue with ethics. If good and evil are in fact reflections of God in some way, shape, or form, then you really don't have a foundation for ethical, moral values and duties. Moral values and duties, whether you take a divine command theory or some type of natural theology, or a natural law that is a reflection of the way that God created everything, or virtue ethics, it's going to be difficult to square with panentheism. So anybody that affirms Sikhism is going to have to go against the apophatic tradition and make clear and distinct definitions to be able to clearly overcome some of these difficulties that I've discussed. And again, I might be misunderstanding the Sikhi tradition, but I've listened to some of the Sikhi scholars, and I mean, if you take God to be impersonal, and so God is just an abstract idea, well, then how can this abstract idea apply to us? And then you can use the cosmological argument or the moral argument or the contingency argument from Leibniz to show that God has to be personal. God can't be impersonal. So with natural theology, you can argue that. And then again, with Anselm, you can argue that God must be that being which no greater can be thought. God must be that being which is, God must be that being the greatest conceivable being. And given that conception of God, God cannot be a God that is numerically identical to his creation, nor can he be numerically distinct to his creation, but mutually dependent necessarily in all possible worlds, right? Now, it's going to be interesting if they take that it's a mutual dependence that is voluntary. And if it's voluntary, if you still conceive of it as that creation is a part of God, like constituent parts of God, well, then you still have the same problems. Now, if you just say that there's a mutual dependence here, but creation is not a constituent part of God, well, then I think the Sikh faith can overcome some of the challenges that I've made. All right. So here are just some thoughts, and feel free to comment in the video. And also, the Sikh conception of salvation, right? It's a very odd conception if they take God to be an abstract principle. You're going to merge. You're going to merge, like, think of a drop of water going into the ocean. If you think of that in terms of an individual person, being submerged with an abstract principle, if they take God to be impersonal, well, how is that? That doesn't make any sense, right? Because in some sense, we are greater than God because we're personal and God is impersonal, right? In other words, they're saying that which is impersonal is fundamental, and that which is personal is derivative of the impersonal, and that doesn't make any sense. It would be more plausible that the personal comes from the personal, not the personal coming from the impersonal. Okay, because that which is greater, it seems like it's this argument from the lesser to the greater, when it should be the opposite, right? The greater and then creates the lesser, right? But yes, these are some thoughts to think about. I hope this is helpful. Yes, I think more about this. I mean, I haven't studied deeply into Sikhism, but I mean, I've encountered it enough to have some thoughts about it. Right? Well, pray this would be interesting to you, and yeah, feel free to leave comments. Again, I need to study like the best scholarship on this issue, but just a general discussion with some Sikhs in the past. And trying to think of some ministries. There are some ministries that are interesting to see their engagement with this, but I don't think that there's a lot of work done in Christian discussion with Sikhs, the Sikh faith. But pray this is interesting. Peace and God bless.